Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, I want to have an in-depth look into unit alloys. This new brand set for Year 7 Season 3 is actually very powerful and pretty interesting, as we have to look at a rate of fire brand bonus here. And as we saw with the recent Stack Broker video, adding to the rate of fire side of things can be very powerful. It of course does affect our burst, sustain, and damage per mag, but not in the same amounts as, for instance, just adding on to the damage end of things. But here we also have two brand bonuses in a row that are very powerful, much more powerful than basically any other brand set really has in two pieces. And for that, we have to give it a thorough in-depth look. This in-depth look will be timestamped so you can jump around. We'll be starting looking at the brand set and then its named items, and then we'll go starting into some calculations. This will be part one of a two-part series. In this first part, we're going to lay the focus especially on Striker, as of course it being the general meta and this affecting kind of that the most. We'll want to look at Strikers first. There will be a second part video, a separate video, where we'll go into other builds, other styles, and look at, for instance, Heartbreaker, Umbra, things like that, and how it affects that. But especially in putting this one kind of together in a spreadsheet, it became obvious that, yeah, we kind of need to do this one separately, otherwise it's a very long video, and also I would have to wait quite a lot longer to be able to put that out. But yeah, let's go get started. And let's start with looking at what unit alloys is, and of course discussing its brand bonuses. As with the one piece, we get a rate of fire, 5% of it. With the two piece, we get 20% assault rifle damage, which that combination is actually bigger than most combinations that we have. There are some brands that do have subsequent parts that are very much damage related, and this actually is one of the bigger ones, because this is kind of in the style of Zvia, where we had some magazine size and then followed up by rifle damage. But this isn't similar to that, because the magazine size that it had, side of things, very much is not a burst DPS change. It does affect sustained DPS, it does affect damage per mag, but the burst DPS was not affected by that. And because of that, it was a first piece that you had to take to get to that second beast bonus, and the second beast bonus was the good part. Now here, what we have with that 5% rate of fire, I'll already kind of spoil further looks in here, where the 5% rate of fire is actually pretty close on a lot of builds towards, for instance, a Chaska piece or a Grupo piece. And that brand bonus means that this being equivalent, that second piece being 20% is actually a little bit overpowered. At the third piece, we get 50% magazine size. And actually, if, for instance, high-ends were actually viable, that 50% magazine size would be worth it once we have invested two pieces, getting that third piece to just have magazine size in somewhat of a similar way, again, as Zvia, where if we already gone two pieces in, going that third piece to get that 30% weapon handling that Zvia has, yeah, in a similar way, you could justify it like that. The thing is, though, that in most gear sets and such, we only get to go up to two pieces, except for with the Ninja Bike. But especially that magazine size would not be worth giving up, for instance, a full backpack talent in the Ninja Bike style. But those first two bonuses being very powerful really stand out here as something quite different than we have had before. And then together with those two brand bonuses at the start being actually very powerful, we also get two names with this. We get the Equalizer named chest as we have here, and that comes with Perfect Obliterate. The Perfect Obliterate's difference to normal Obliterate is that it stacks up to 24 times, and because each stack is 1 total weapon damage, we are getting 4% more total weapon damage here with a total of 24% instead of the 20 of a normal Obliterate. So that combination is actually very strong, and the Equalizer has no equal. It is very much unequalizing things, as this now is the de facto Obliterate. Effectively, if we're going obliterate, there is really no reason to go this. That means that Cheska chests with obliterate, Grupo chests with obliterate, Fenris chests with obliterate and such really don't stand a chance against the combination, especially of that first brand bonus, especially being equivalent to most of those, but then a much stronger obliterate, of course. And especially if we kind of go into a second piece as well, then that second piece bonus is actually much larger than a lot of other brand bonuses, because yeah, if we look at Fenris, of course, 10%, this is literally double. Then we also have the Salvo, as we have them here, and that has as a special stat, one of the stats is flipped to be rate of fire as its distinct named stat. And 5% rate of fire, together with, of course, having 5% from the brand bonus as well. From just one piece, we could have 10% rate of fire, but this comes, of course, at the cost of a brand bonus, or, well, it is in competition to a brand bonus, and then also a stat here, of course. Now, either here we could have 6 crit chance or 12 crit damage, although we have crit chance here already. And then on the rate of fire end, of course, it's competing, for instance, with Cheska, where it's 8 crit chance. In the case of having unit alloys, the brand bonus being 5%, being kind of equivalent to the 8% that we have on Cheska, as we kind of discussed, you can already guess that this 5% here, being against 6% crit chance or 12% crit damage, is actually a little bit higher than that. That means that the combination of the brand bonuses plus these name pieces really do actually add up. And it does make it that we're kind of power creeping our way up a little bit. Now, in the PTS, actually, it was a little bit even higher with 8%. And yeah, that was, to me, actually kind of, way too much. I advocated for, as well, to bring it down a little bit. And I'm actually kind of happy that they did, at least with this one thing, because honestly, we're getting 3 pretty OP things. And in the end, actually, the Salvo is kind of in a balanced spot, but I would definitely say that the Equalizer and the Brandset itself actually are pretty high above other things. And it is handy to know that you can get the blueprints for all 6 pieces here from the season track. These are also just available, of course, even if you don't have the season pass, of course. As you go through the season, you will get all of the items one by one. And actually in the same slot as is the item, you also get the blueprints from them. That's where the blueprints for the 6 pieces themselves come from. And then you also have, from the reconstructed caches, you can get the blueprints already from Salvo and Equalizer. And it can be very handy, especially if you already have all of the blueprints. Effectively, if you just open up 4 caches for this season, you'll get both of the named weapons and both of the named gear available to you. In the week of, if you watch this in the week of its release, there is also actually on a vendor, there is some unit alloys. It is on the Brooklyn vendor, so you can go there, actually buy and deconstruct, and very easily craft yourselves an Equalizer or a Salvo, which can make it pretty easy if you have basically access to them through the reconstructed caches quickly. Also, briefly, I want to point out that, yeah, the looks of it in the game, of course, as we're wearing all 6 pieces here, and that was just to kind of showcase it, the looks-wise, it is a direct copy of Hanayu, and yeah, a very familiar backpack and gloves. But yeah, they did actually take the time, as you see there, to apply the unit alloys logo and actually a little text there also stating the same. Yeah, it is actually reuse, but at least a little bit improved. But yeah, from a looks perspective, it is. I'm always looking forward to seeing some of the new brand sets and gear sets, and always hoping for something new, but yeah, that is not what we're getting here, sadly. And let's start diving into some numbers. As of course, for those, I've prepared multiple multi-calculators here, as we always do. And in going through this, yeah, it became clear that for the scope of one video, we should kind of limit it to, for instance, that we're doing here, to Striker. We'll do a part 2 where we'll go over other builds, but those parts are not ready yet. I'll link, of course, to this spreadsheet so you can go and look at it for yourself. And as we'll go through here, we'll lay out different sections. Everything will be timestamped, as we'll first look at especially how much unit alloys just by itself kind of can provide by putting it on an OD build where we can't per se use the named items. So without the named items in there, how much does unit give us? Then we'll go to looking at strikers with Equalizer, then strikers with Salvo. Then we'll actually take a brief detour here into looking at the stacking differences and how much more quickly can units stack versus, for instance, just going basic striker or the old striker with Cheska, for instance. And then we'll bring both together, looking at Equalizer plus Salvo, and then especially concentrating on ARs at that point, of course, because that second bonus is really big. And when we combine them, we kind of want to know how it stacks up against other things. Now, for ARs, of course, that's not going to work out because that 20% AR damage, that's going to be bigger than any other brand or named item, especially for ARs, as we can compare it, for instance, to Cheska or Foxes and such, but those won't win. And then we'll end off here with looking at versus exotics, because of course there are some items that can be very competitive with it. And yeah, we'll go through each of these by themselves. These are multi-calculators of my design. If you want to go and delve deeper into them, there is actually a video on my channel going over it. The brief of it is that the builds information goes down here, where we input it here. We get the weapon stats and input them here. And then especially we can compare up to 10 builds. Each row is a build, and we're always comparing to the build in the top slot here. And we get some percentages to do that with. And we're getting a burst DPS, a sustained DPS, and a damage per mag. And we can look between the builds and see what the differences with them will be, going with different pieces. We also get some checking numbers and the builds multiplier here as well. So yeah, let's go have a deep look. And let's start this in-depth look by actually not looking at Striker, even though we said the focus is going to be on Striker. We first want to look at unit in isolation, and that's just a brand bonus without looking at Equalizer, without looking at Salvo. How well does 5% rate of fire, especially that first piece bonus, really stack up against things, for instance, like Cheska as the go-to? For that, we'll actually go to Ongoing Directive, and the big reason that we won't start on Striker is that Ongoing Directive doesn't really have any bonuses, especially either towards the crit chance, crit damage side of things like Negotiator or Umber would, which would kind of influence it a little bit against Cheska. So the build itself is kind of very middle of the road when it comes to crit chance, crit damage, and also it is not running Killer, especially, which would, in effect, benefit actually a little bit from running a unit, because our crit chance could still be high, our crit damage could be a little bit lower. The effectiveness of Killer is affected by that, of course. And also, yeah, it doesn't have rate of fire like Striker, as we're going to look into in a second. If we take it as this, especially because here as well, we can't really run Equalizer or such. We want to keep the Ongoing Directive chest. Tinkerer is kind of a must. We're going to go with Sadist and Pressure Point as our comparison talents, just to not feed, for instance, with Vindictive into crit chance, crit damage. What happens if we take this Cheska backpack effectively, either with Wicked or Vigilance, but here for the calculation, we're just going with Vigilance, but that's just total weapon damage. That's not per se interacting with either rate of fire or crit chance, crit damage. What if we take this Cheska backpack and made it unit alloys? Now, of course, we have several ways that we can lay that out, and that's especially true this crit chances that we have here, because we can actually flip one of these crit chances to crit damage on the weapon, flipping a 5 crit chance for a 10 crit damage. And then we could, on the gear, grab either with a mod or one of the stats, going from crit damage then to crit chance. What that effectively does is it shifts our crit chance 1 up, and our crit damage goes down by 2. A very fair trade, but that way we can actually set up in different crit chances in a 3 crit chance range. And that's also why this is with 3 different values here for unit. We have Ongoing Directive here, and as our comparison point, the Cheska with that Vigilance, unit with Vigilance, but then at 58.5, 59.5, and 60.5, but then the 60.5, of course, is just capping at 60 as as of course will be the case. As we see from the numbers here, the 59.5 has the others beat by a tiny margin, and that'll be as well the one that will then will let compete basically against the Cheska. As we can see on the burst DPS end, we are gaining a third of a percent, 20.29% here. That isn't a big difference in the burst DPS. Unit alloys here on a gear set that doesn't feed into rate of fire is actually a tiny bit ahead on the burst DPS over Cheska. But then, of course, Cheska actually feeds onto the damage end of, because if we're looking at burst DPS, what it especially is the damage, average damage times rounds per second. The rounds per second is derived from the rounds per minute divided by 60. If we're feeding up into there, our damage per mag and such isn't affected actually, or in effect is lower than the Cheska because it is going into there. Because the Cheska is feeding especially onto the damage end of things. And we see that result here in the same way as with the stack broker that we looked in. Feeding into the rate of fire side of things increases especially the burst DPS a little bit more than it does the sustain DPS. We're firing just a little bit faster. We're hitting our reloads, which are exactly the same, more often. Because of that, we're dropping a little bit in the sustain. We're also dropping a decent amount here in the damage per mag. And the damage per mag is actually important to ongoing directive because that is how much hollow point ammo we basically have until we run out. If we can't kill the enemy within, well, this amount, but this is a humongous amount, we could kill basically any heroic enemy with 113 million. But that means, of course, we're kind of going for theoreticals and we're landing every shot as it should. That's, of course, not going to happen. That's also why damage per mag does matter, but from a play perspective, the difference between this wouldn't be that big or that noticeable. It wouldn't be as noticeable as, for instance, going with an AR or something. The main reason I do go with an LMG with ongoing directive is I do want a higher damage per mag. But yeah, we are gaining a tiny amount on the burst DPS and we're losing on the sustain DPS and the damage per mag. Now for a build like Strikers that then with that higher RPM that it has actually gains, for instance, as well on the stacking, we could lean towards unit a little bit more. But honestly, with a tiny gain in burst, but a little bit more loss in sustain and actually a loss in damage per mag, I'm going to keep that ongoing directive with that Cheska backpack. But I could definitely see a case being made of going, this is just higher burst DPS, so I'm just going to lean for that. And yeah, I could understand that as well. So, but what we can conclude from this segment is that actually unit alloys with its 5% rate of fire is basically equivalent to Cheska, which was previously and currently still alongside of unit alloys, basically the top pick as the first thing we put into a build. But then Cheska pushes into the damage side of things, unit alloys pushes into the rate of fire side of things, and on a build here that doesn't have your rate of fire itself, we can see that, yeah, it is actually, it is ahead. But then, of course, on Striker, actually, we're going to diminish it by adding it additively to the 15 that Striker already has. And because of that, it actually is going to be a tiny bit behind Cheska. But yeah, let's go get looking at that. As indeed, let's move it on to Striker, the focus of here. And let's start with the Equalizer. The Equalizer is very much unequal. It is unequalable. And I do hope actually that the flavor text that they've placed on this thing of building them up to bring them down isn't foreshadowing, because honestly, if it is, bravo. But it is very much the top piece of this gear set, and its perfect obliterate, I'll basically already kind of spoil here before we even look into the numbers. As we saw, the brand bonus of just 5% rate of fire is equivalent to Cheska, effectively. Even on Striker, where it loses a little bit, as we'll see in a second, it doesn't lose all the way. But then, of course, we have 4% more here from its stacking. Now, we do also need to get 4 more stacks, but that is effectively not an issue. Especially with Striker, it's going to take longer to stack up Striker than it will take to stack up Obliterate. And of course, Obliterate in the past used to even be 25%. We'll be especially looking in it in the calculator in a second in this layout where we're taking a Lexington, 4 pieces of Striker, Equalizer, and then putting the overdogs. And we're just putting basically an exotic in there just to not go to the 2-piece yet, to the 2-piece bonus, just to, in isolation, kind of look at the Equalizer by itself. If we go back to the spreadsheet, that's what we have here, and we can actually set it up in 2 different ways. And this is again due to what crit mods we go on the weapon. Now, the thing here is though that to get to 58 crit chance, what we have to do is take 3 crit damage mods on the weapon, and not every weapon can do that. So for instance, the FAMAS, the CTAR, the F2000, some of the higher picks, you basically need a long rail to be able to equip a crit damage mod on the underbarrel. And all of the weapons listed there, they don't have that as an option, so they can't actually go for this 58. As well, we're also including this 60, where we're taking 3 crit chance mods on the weapon, and then we're just shifting the crit chance rolls amount that we have on the gear itself. That does, of course, shift around a little bit in our crit damage as well. To point out that 60, that is a capped at 60, that's actually a 61. We're wasting 1 crit chance, and that's why that's 58 will actually win out, as we see here. So that 58 variant is then also actually the optimal way to set it up, but that can only be done with some weapons, like for instance the Lexington, but then you need to have a Lexington. You're replacing it, for instance, with a FAMAS or such, then you kind of need to go for the other one. But also, as we see, the difference isn't that large. But there is definitely a difference there, and we do need to consider, you know, the optimal way to set it up. But for me as well, quite often, I will just actually keep it on 15% crit chance on the weapon, mostly as well because I can just then slot in some of the exotics, for instance, like Elmo and such. There's also a thing to be said, though, that if we take it to 0 crit chance on the weapon and just have 30 crit damage there, you can also slot in Bighorn much more easily. So, you know, swings and roundabouts. But yeah, there's basically 2 variants in it. And also going through all of this, we'll be having multiple variants constantly. But yeah, the difference will be in those mods. But then also, yeah, not every weapon, if you're maining, for instance, a CTAR and you prefer that, or you don't have a Lexington, for instance, and that is your choice for the time being, then yeah, you wouldn't be able to take the crit damage version. Then we're taking it here when we're looking at the Equalizer. Yeah, as we saw, the Equalizer itself, of course, versus in its 2 variants, the 61 version, but then caps at 60, of course, it is a tiny bit behind on basically all metrics. We're losing a little less than 1% on each of those. If we're going to just instead of taking the Equalizer, what if we took just the unit piece with normal obliterate, which you just wouldn't, of course, you have the named version available. But here we can see the difference, because now we're still taking the unit brand bonus, but we aren't taking the perfect obliterate. So we can see how much perfect obliterate adds. And yeah, that is effectively in the downwards, it is a little less than the 4%. Of course, in the upwards, it would be just 4%, because we're just adding a separate multiplier here that is, instead of being 24, is now 20. So that's, as we saw, unit versus Cheska, not that big of a difference, but yeah, perfect obliterate versus normal obliterate, as we see here, is a pretty big difference. And that continues then here, where we see that actually the Cheska, where we saw it with OD actually being a tiny bit behind, because there's rate of fire on strikers already, it is actually now ahead, at least if we're looking at normal unit with obliterate versus Cheska with normal obliterate. But then, of course, if we look at it versus perfect obliterate, yeah, it falls quite a bit behind. And then, of course, Cheska already was ahead of Grupo and Fenris. I've just included them here to remind as well of that. Generally, if you were going with an obliterate chest on a striker, you should be going Cheska in the past. But actually moving forward, especially this Equalizer has no equal here. And the story actually gets a little bit worse for it, as one thing that I've prepared here and will use multiple times is that we have multiple talents, of course, available. Especially Killer is one of the big ones, of course. If we activate killer, and I'm going to trigger that one on here, we can just activate it like that. And especially here on the side, we can see how much we gain from killer per build. Now, of course, from an absolute value, actually the Cheska moved back a little. If we look at that number from Cheska, as I triggered on and off, we see it goes from 97.61 with killer off before killer is activated, and then drops to a 97.3. And that's, of course, understandable because the combined crit chance crit damage of a build, that is basically a pool together actually with headshot as well, as that goes into that same pool if you are headshotting. And that can have pretty hefty diminishing returns because we're really high up there once killer gets activated in the crit damage is there. And that means that especially when killer is activated, actually, because if we take the rate of fire one, which isn't interacting with that part of the build, killer is actually bigger on unit alloys just by itself, and even more so, of course, on the Equalizer, which already is bigger. And yeah, on the measured end though, actually, and this is a little bit interesting, because we're feeding into that rate of fire, we're actually not gaining as much from measured as we do from if we were wearing Cheska. Measured is here on 10.97, here is a 10.42. It is a 0.5%, but still an interesting difference there. So you could maybe make a case, although actually you can't here, but if we're just taking a unit piece, which we'll see in a second with Salvo, that you could go, for instance, if the talent could make a difference there. But when it comes to the Equalizer, even with any of the talents, as we also have streamlined here, in all of those cases, it's ahead and heavily ahead. It never basically drops below 2% ahead of Cheska Striker. So Equalizer, and very much just understandably from, as we saw it from PTS already, as we looked into it there, is so much ahead that, yeah, it is now the de facto Obliterate chest. If you're using Obliterate, it is very likely that this is the Obliterate that should be in there, especially because even any Obliterate we would take is already going to be a build that could likely benefit from rate of fire, because Obliterate itself already is much more, and we don't per se use it with rifles and such because they are actually a little bit slower to stack that up. And yeah, because of that, it having a rate of fire bonus, Equalizer is basically unequalable by anything else. And if we are going Obliterate, it is our go-to. And let's move it on to the Salvo here. And here we'll be doing the same, taking Salvo here first with Overdogs, just taking Overdogs as just basic exotic that we can just stick in here, just to look to the Salvo just by itself in isolation. And here as well, then we're looking at a chest striker, as we see from the 180 stacks there in a second again. But here the Salvo gone in a flash. It is an rate of fire stat that we get here extra. And in most cases, we're just going to be giving up effectively a crit damage roll here in comparison to, for instance, if we were running just a unit piece just by itself. So if we just had a non-named holster here. And of course, versus Cheska, it would be versus the brand bonus versus brand bonus. And as we saw, those kind of lined up decently well with on the OD, it being a little bit in the favor of unit alloys on the burst DPS, but then on the sustain and on the damage per mag, losing out a little bit. Here on the rate of fire being 5% versus the 6% that we have on a stat roll. Yeah, that of course is, yeah, here it's going to do a little bit better, or well, 12 crit damage maybe instead. It's going to do a little bit better than the 5% here would against the 8 crit chance from Cheska. Effectively, it's always 5% on the unit side here with the name as well. If we go back here, yeah, looking at Overdogs, actually because of that crit damage, that extra that we lose effectively for that rate of fire that we have there on the Salvo, the crit damage is dropping so low that actually the balanced setup for it is 55 as we have here. That is that same 61 that we had a second ago with 1 crit chance roll less. We can also still set it up at 58. And as we'll see in a second, that for killer actually is better, but here for just the base numbers, it isn't. And that's why we're including the 55 here as well. We weren't with the Equalizer because actually there it was behind. That one crit damage makes that difference. But without any damage talents or just basically nothing of the damage talents that add into crit or such activated, the 55 actually is the balanced setup. And here, of course, as well, we don't have obliterate or something triggering off of crit chance as well. That is actually also an important distinction to make, is that, yeah, for instance, the 60 version will actually stack quite a bit better than the 55. It isn't a big difference, though, between 58 and 60 when it comes to that. Here, though, yeah, we have the salvos. The 55 is a little bit ahead. What if we go to a unit holster? So instead of having that be the salvo, just a normal unit holster, same brand bonus, but we have a 12 crit damage versus that rate of fire. And what we see is that it is a tiny bit behind on the burst DPS as we have it here. And it is actually a little bit ahead on the damage per mag on the sustain, because of course, again, now we're giving up that rate of fire for the damage side stat. And yeah, those will affect the sustain and the damage per mag a little bit more than that rate of fire would. Now, especially as well against the sustain, it actually, again, is inversely, it actually doesn't like too much higher rate of fire because, yeah, we're hitting our reloads more often and that eats into that sustain. But then if we actually compare it here with Cheska, the crit is now so low that the Cheska actually is performing a little bit better and beating it actually on the Chest Striker as we had it there. Because of the low crits, it is beating it outright, even on the burst. And that means that, for instance, in this case, where it's also on the damage per max, significantly higher, and even on the sustain end, it is about 4% higher. At least for the one piece, the salvo isn't the way per se to go, at least here for the striker. In the future, we'll look at it, for instance, in the Heartbreaker Tech Tank. I think there actually it could have a pretty significant usage, mostly because there as well, it'll help us with the stacking. We'll look actually in the stacking in a second as well, which is, it is also an important thing. But here, though, it's being ahead on burst and such, that stacking difference isn't going to make a same amount of difference than it would that, for instance, with the Equalizer. And of course, with the Equalizer, that talent was way bigger. And this kind of also shows that that salvo actually, that's that 5% rate of fire, at least here on Striker, where we're even pushing it a little bit higher, because of course, if we're going with the salvo, we will definitely have at least one piece brand bonus, and then the rate of fire there. We're adding 10% rate of fire onto already 15 from Striker. And in the future, we'll look, for instance, in Heartbreaker and, for instance, in Negotiator, if that makes it a little bit more difference there. But here on Striker, at least for if we are wanting to use an exotic alongside of it, the leaning for me is definitely Cheska plus Overdox, Cheska plus Tinkerer, or things like that. One thing, though, that we definitely want to have a look at is that if we look here at the Salvo plus unit, there is actually an usage there. Now, actually, here I have Overdox turned off. Let's turn Overdox back on, because yeah, that actually should have been on. Doesn't change the percentages here, because it is a 30% basically, all to basically a separate multiplier. So all these numbers just went up by 30%. But to compare it with the Overdogs on versus here the Salvo plus unit, it is actually 20% ahead. This black number is how much it is ahead here, meaning that that unit by itself is giving, with that brand bonus and its stats, is giving around the 9, oh, well, especially that brand bonus is giving around 9% difference here. If we then turn off Overdogs, then now it is ahead by 7%. And that is, of course, the difference between those two. The unit plus salvo, or salvo plus a unit piece, especially in the Chest Striker, will just be always active, will be just this amount consistently. And Overdogs doesn't work everywhere. But when Overdog works, and especially for just general play, missions, activities, things like that, it works out to be overall ahead, I feel, than the Salvo Plus Unit version. Here as well, once we turn on Killer, actually on top of all of this, we see that actually the Cheska does move down a tiny bit, but not by much. It went from a 10.55 difference to a 10.51. And also on the sustain, we lost a tiny bit. That is, of course, again, there is a tiny bit of crit damage difference. The Killer on unit is going to, or on the Salvo piece plus Overdogs, is actually going to be a little bit more than it is on the Cheska. In the second part as well, we'll actually look into the Killer activation rate. Now, with the numbers being not that dissimilar here, there's not going to be a very huge difference between them, but there will still be a difference. And I am curious in if that makes a difference there. And if you're interested, I have a video on the Killer activation rate. A lot of people think it is basically what your crit chance is. That isn't true at all. It is very reliant on the difference between how alongside of that. It is very, because yeah, that is an important factor, how much your crit chance is. But alongside of that, it is dependent on how much your non-crit and your crit differ. Because especially if you need to do multiple non-crits to be the size of one crit, then you're increasing the chances of activating Killer, because it is very much more likely that the kill shot will be a crit. And I have a full video going into that if you're interested. But yeah, here we see that it is actually quite a difference between, here at least, between, well, there isn't that humongous of a difference, but it is still leaning towards Cheska when it comes to the one piece bonus. And while the Salvo Plus unit, as we'll look into it in a minute as well against other exotics, can be pretty good, especially, well, we need it to be an AR at that point because we're getting that assault rifle damage. It works out decently well, but Overdogs is still a step above. One thing of note as well here is, of course, that second piece unit, that Salvo Plus unit, is actually weapon damage, of course. The red cores that we have and the grading that we have really makes a difference. So if we set this actually to 0 red cores and 0 grading, the number jumps up quite a bit. And actually versus the Overdogs in the inverse, now the Overdogs, when it is active, it is only 13% ahead. So it really does depend as well how much grading and how many blue cores you have. But seeing as in most cases we're looking at either 4 or 6 blue cores, 4 to 6 blue cores, and most people will eventually hit at least 20 grading and then maybe even more. Yeah, it is going to lean towards, for instance, yeah, Cheska plus Overdogs as a general meta there. And now briefly, I want to actually look at the stacking differences between having Striker just by itself, a 15 rate of fire, 20 rate of fire from having Striker plus unit, and a 25 rate of fire total from having Salvo in the mix as well. Because of course, actually, Striker is a stacking build. Heartbreaker as well, if we look into it in the future, is also a stacking build. They do benefit from more rate of fire for the stacking. And even if you lose, for instance, a little bit of sustain DPS or, for instance, a little bit of damage per mag, that can be worth it if the RPM differences are enough. Here, though, actually, what we'll see is this is a time scale going from 0 all the way, well, up to 4 here. Where it becomes red is actually where the gun has ran out of ammo at that point. Before it runs out of ammo. And that means that, yeah, as we go up, as we see here, just Striker by itself at 1 second with the Lexington here with its RPM is getting 1620.29 stacks if all shots are hitting. And of course, between the 3 of these, we're using the same weapon, so we should be hitting around the same, you know, here we're going for all shots are hitting, but just accuracy coming into play and just in reality playing, the differences between them wouldn't be different because the handling and such isn't different. It's on different weapons. This is just different build underlying it, a little bit different RPM. So we can kind of compare them in this way. With the units, it is 17 rounds on the second, and on the Salvo, it is 17.71. All of these aren't that dissimilar, but especially if we're kind of looking at once we have reach the point where most of the guns are about to run out, this 2.8 seconds that we have here, we do have, actually, when we're running the salvo, especially on top of a unit, well, we'll have a unit piece because the salvo is one, we are at 45 here on the 45.62 on just Striker, but we are on 49.58. Now, the difference between them is a little less than 4 stacks there at that 2.8 seconds. But that 4 stacks is 0.9, 4 times 0.9, so that is a total of 3.6% damage difference as well on a Obliterate Striker, for instance. So that does matter, but it isn't, for instance, here as big of a difference as it was as we looked at in a little while ago at the Stack Broker, which was a 20% rate of fire difference just by itself. And that made quite a bit more difference. Here, though, it does still make a difference, though. If we look at it in a longer time scale, and then especially here, we're doing similar thing as we did with the Stack Broker. We're putting together a time scale where this is the firing time plus reload, another firing time, another reload, another firing time, another reload. And of course, that is different per item that we have here. And that's also, again, why this is a little bit mangled as we're overlapping here, three charts over each other. But we're on the scales, on both the stacking scale and the time scale, they're overlapping perfectly, but that also means that their names are very much mangled. Here, the red that we see being ahead and then flattening out over each other, they'll just, the other two will disappear behind, but the red that we see here, that's the salvo. The unit that we see here is the green that we have there, and then the strikers by itself is the blue. Now, what we can see here is even on, for instance, the 20-second mark, or actually, well, we can actually better look at here 200 stacks. If we were to stack 200 just by using the gun. Now, of course, as well, as we go up, Striker loses stacks. We're not including that here, even though it would make a tiny difference, but just factoring that in is a lot of complexity to add here. And this is good enough for what we need to show. And that is that at reaching that 200 stack mark, but here in reality it will be a little bit below, of course, because we'll be losing stacks along the way. The difference is marginal. So all of them are stacking here in what effectively could be said to be around the 17 to 18 second mark, maybe a little bit below the 17 here, maybe. That isn't a significant difference because, yeah, as we see here as well, the 200 stacks here is a 17.21, and for the Striker is a 18.23. It is almost a second difference, but that wouldn't per se be a deal breaker, especially when it comes to stacking up and the differences that they have in sustained DPS. It's definitely a thing to factor in there when they are close enough. But yeah, it really is going to rely more on the burst DPS and the sustained DPS, at least for my purposes. And now let's go into their powers combined, Equalizer plus Salvo. There's, of course, an important note that we need to have there is that when we go to the 2-piece, we also get a different bonus now. So up to here, we were talking about 1 piece, basically, of unit together with, for instance, an exotic. And in a second, we'll go into actually, a different table where we're looking at it with, for instance, Equalizer plus Salvo versus the exotics. But here, though, first, I kind of wanted to see versus different, for instance, Fox's Prayer, Contractors, and such, how the Salvo secondary especially would stack up. But then, of course, there's also, on the 2-piece, we're getting 20% assault rifle damage. This is a lot more than, for instance, the 10% from a Fenris. But yeah, even, for instance, a lot of second-piece brand bonuses on other things, even if we're looking at 15% or 13% headshot damage on Providence, that second piece is not 16%. Crit chance, it's just 8, and that's for good reason. This combination, when I first saw it, I actually facepalmed a little at the stream, at the dev stream. Because to me, this is actually very much an overpowered thing and power creep in itself. Because I feel if you want to do this 20% assault rifle damage, then the first brand bonus should be maybe something like weapon handling, something not per se damage related, but something useful that you can take along the way in the same way as, for instance, via 15% magazine size along the way to 20% rifle damage. But yeah, it isn't, for instance, some crit chance there and then rifle damage. Now, these kind of pieces will be also decently okay for instance, high ends and such, but of course we can stick them here into all the gear sets as well. And some people brought up this would be good for high ends, but yeah, that's actually not how that works out, because if something is good for the high ends, as long as it's below the 3 pieces, it will also be good for all of the gear sets like Striker, like Heartbreaker. Now, even the 3rd piece bonus can be brought in there with the Ninja Bike, but then the Ninja Bike loses a lot more. We already looked at the Ninja Bike with this, for instance, in the PTS numbers. If you're interested in that, go look at that, as I know a lot of people will be. Overall, I don't think there is any competitive setup with the Ninja Bike that you could make with this. And especially as well, I would forgo going 3 pieces or 3 brand bonus of unit alloys. And if you really do want a Ninja Bike, then just go Ninja Bike 1-piece unit, 1-piece Fenris. Because instead of that 50% magazine size, you would get 10% weapon damage and 30% reload. And that's actually very competitive to that. Going back though to Equalizer plus Salvo, what if we put it up against all of the other named pieces that have special bonuses? But of course here, what is going to happen is actually pretty predictable, and that is that 5% rate of fire, even if it is, for instance, less than the 8% DTOC, because it can apply that 20% assault rifle damage, as long as it's an assault rifle, and we're starting out here with the Lexington, before we start looking at it with an SMG, yeah, it's going to be quite a bit ahead. And we can see that difference here as well, actually, that the Equalizer plus Salvo, if we then, instead of Equalizer, we take a unit piece with just normal obliterate, so we don't go with the perfect obliterate effectively, the rest of it is all the same. We can see that that perfect obliterate really makes a difference. But then actually, if we look at Equalizer plus a piece of unit, and then in this case, just cutting out basically the salvo, it's 5% rate of fire extra. We see actually that that is not that big of a difference. It is actually just a tiny bit ahead or behind on the, well, the salvo plus Equalizer is a tiny bit ahead on the burst, but a meaningless number. Basically, it is less than, well, 0.2% or 0.02%, but it's losing on the damage per mag, and it's losing a little bit on the sustain end. So actually, the Equalizer plus Salvo, I would lean more towards an Equalizer plus a unit piece. And there we're getting a little bit more, of course, instead of that rate of fire, we're gaining crit damage. Although when we go with Killer here in a second, it'll lean a little bit the other way, but then the sustain is still ahead. But if we go then instead Equalizer plus Cheska, now here with an AR, we're dropping that 20% assault rifle damage with 8% crit chance as that second piece. And yeah, none of these will compete. We'll just go quick and spoil it. Cheska, Fox, Contractors, Hollow Man, or just an utility piece. So we're giving up the brand bonus if we're, for instance, going with Palisade or Bellstone or something like that. All of those are pretty far behind. None of them come close in sustain. If it is an AR, the only place where, for instance, the Cheska can be competitive is in the damage per mag, but yeah, it's losing so much in the burst and in the sustain that if we're going with an AR and we aren't taking an exotic, and that is a important point, we'll come to the exotics in a second as you can see them peeking down there. If we just want to take 2 pieces of high end alongside the striker with an AR, yeah, Equalizer plus unit is actually the way that I would lean. If we activate Killer, one of the more popular talents there, of course, the plus unit version drops a little bit on that burst difference. Now it is actually a tiny bit behind. It is still ahead on the sustain. It is still ahead on the damage per mag. The difference, though, is between them is tiny, and you could make a case that here the salvo is stacking a little bit faster. But that's also why I put that segment just before here. The difference between them is tiny, because there as well, we're talking mostly about striker versus salvo, a 10% difference. This is, of course, with unit already in there, and that's just a 5% difference, just the difference from the salvo piece. And that's even smaller, and not per se a meaningful difference for the loss of that little bit of sustain here and that damage per mag. So I would actually lean towards having an equalizer plus just the unit piece, but the difference is as well. This is if we're talking about min-maxing to an extreme. In general play, I would say generally anything below 2% difference, you could play for it with a day and not be able to tell the difference between the two. You basically need above 2% for it to really make a difference. If we go instead here with measured, actually the unit pulls a little bit ahead. So instead of the salvo piece being an equalizer plus unit, and the reason for that is, of course, that rate of fire actually adversely affects the measured. And yeah, this way around, if you're running measured, yeah, I would say definitely equalizer plus unit, because we're gaining also significantly more on the sustain end, even when the burst is basically effectively the same, but the other stats are a little bit better. With an AR, yeah, none of the other ones even come close to even being a contender, really, mostly because, yeah, that 20% assault rifle damage. The only one you could make a case for, and that's also why it's in here and actually handy to know, you can basically drop, well, a little bit under, or well, a little bit over 11% on your burst CPS, and for instance, yeah, take an Palisade piece as a secondary. But yeah, that second piece is actually very strong, and really only thing that will contend with it is exotics. If we actually then, for instance, consider it with SMGs, which I would say, in a very obvious sense, well, if we're wasting that 20% assault rifle damage, we're kind of in the same ballpark as, for instance, Fox's Prayers and such, of course. And yeah, those will be ahead, but of course, Chaska is actually the piece that there will be working the best. If we turn off measured again, just to go without a talent, we see that the Chaska piece, if we're looking at it with equalizer plus salvo versus equalizer plus Chaska with an SMG, so we're wasting that 20% assault rifle damage. Yeah, the Chaska has it beat, and basically by the amount that its brand bonus is active here. Now, of course, with SMGs, our crit chance, crit damage is actually pretty high. Our crit chance especially is pretty high. We can trade that in on the gear to crit damages, so our crit damage also becomes pretty high. And because of that, actually, Chaska isn't that large here as it is, for instance, just with an AR. But it is, of course, yes, still significantly ahead on the burst, on sustain, and of course on the damage per mag. So yeah, it doesn't work out as a two-piece for anything but ARs, but especially for ARs, it is effectively only kept in check by exotics. And all of that brings us to this final multi-calculator for this video, where we'll pull everything together that we've learned so far and kind of bring it to a crescendo, to a climax. This will be our climax mission, or the first part at least, of Unit. As we discussed in the previous one, in the previous multi-calculator, the Equalizer plus Unit was kind of our pick. If we're going two pieces high-end, effectively, as long as we're running ARs, effectively nothing else really is competitive with it. Nothing is even really close. But that's, of course, two pieces high-end. There are exotics, and exotics, of course, can be quite a step above. Now, for general play, Overdogs is definitely my general pick nowadays. With even a decent amount of uptime, it can beat most other competition. And for general play, that uptime is actually pretty high. If you I've spent some time here and there kind of reviewing footage, kind of getting a feel for what the uptime is. It differs quite a lot because, especially for instance, Black Dusk and such, if you're doing a lot of legendaries, for instance, it can drop a little bit lower, but I would say a general uptime of around, well, at the very least 50%. My guesstimation is more towards a 60% uptime, even if you're not paying attention to it at all. And if you're paying attention to it a little bit more, you can actually push that up a little bit. Overdogs, though, has one failing in that, for instance, if we are doing, let's say, legendaries, and if we're going to UA, for instance, it is fine. The last enemy alive on the boss fight will be the boss, and it will be active against that. If we're doing Roosevelt, the Marauders that we want to kill quickly at the start, the Marauders are way high up on that list, and because of that, you won't be bonused against them until you basically kill everything else, and that's not the order of things you want to do it in. So situationally still, there is a case to be made against the Overdogs, but for general play, especially just doing activities and missions, Overdogs has become my go-to, and that's the main one we'll look at here. Of course, Coyote in two ranges here, in the 15 to 25 and the 0 to 15, kind of in the right range and the wrong range, as we've had it set up here. Then we'll also look at Exodus and Nimble, and Exodus and Nimble will be basically our stand-in for exotics. Both of these exotics basically not adding to damage, but they're adding to survivability in other ways. That way as well, we can use that as a baseline, and that's actually what this calculation on the right side is, these black numbers comparing against just the 100% point, basically being that Exodus and Nimble. We can kind of see what either the brand bonuses or the other exotics are above it. So for instance here, if the Overdogs is just active at 100%, 30% amp on it, of course, where it's 30% above. So, but of course, it's kind of handy to see that we have that brand bonus of just unit on top. We're gaining that 7% there, the second piece. So the 20% assault rifle damage we're putting in at 6 blue or 6 red cores, 30 grading. So basically the worst case scenario for it before talents come into play. Yeah, it is. That 20% basically becomes a 7.69% as we have there. And then we have also Bloody, special Bloodies in here, as it also will feed into, as it is total weapon damage. Even though it says it is weapon damage, it is actually total weapon damage, 25% of it when it is active. It is pretty consistent to activate it, and was one of our go-tos actually in the past, and still is for some content. And lastly, Tinkerer. And for Tinkerer as well, we're adding a second row of talents here. Also, actually, if we go to the build in-game, just to show it for a second, it is actually with a FAMAS, and that'll be our main weapon we'll be comparing with. Because we'll be taking in the Tinkerer, of course, cannot use named items, and the Lexington, of course, is a named item and excluded. So, just to keep it mostly a comparison of the build side of things, we're going all with a FAMAS, but I have still actually included an Equalizer plus unit with Lexington, because of course with that we can go Lexington if we have one, and the Lexington is in most metrics a little bit better than the FAMAS. There is a reason why it is the go-to AR. But yeah, we'll be including effectively always the Equalizer. We're keeping it to an Obliterate Striker. And then, yeah, what exotic can we put here and what metrics can we get out of it? Because especially with that chest striker, as we kind of saw, yeah, we can go, for instance, with Overdogs, especially. We can take a unit piece or a Cheska piece, but as we saw, the Cheska piece basically equivalent or better. And that means that the chest striker actually will still remain the domain of, for instance, Cheska plus an exotic, or going 2 pieces of unit, just the 2 just high-end pieces, not the names. If we go back to here, if we are looking at this Obliterate Striker, let's first discuss, Overdogs and its uptime. And here is actually one good way of talking about this, because as we saw, actually Equalizer plus unit, if we actually look at Coyote, actually maybe even first, because Coyote was one of our go-tos always. A very consistent piece, but you had basically the right range and the wrong range. If you are mostly in the right range, it was very much higher than most other pieces. And usually, if in the past, like Cheska and Grupo, and if you were in the wrong range, you would be basically a little bit behind, for instance, a Cheska piece or such, or a Grupo piece as a secondary. That's why the Coyote was the go-to always that it was. And we see here actually that Equalizer plus unit, the Coyote in the right range actually is ahead on burst. It is actually a tiny bit ahead as well on both burst and sustain here, a bit ahead. And what we lose there, because we're, of course, yeah, this is no longer with the salvo, so we're not pushing that much into the rate of fire. That helps it a little bit out to be a little bit closer. That's also why I went with the Equalizer plus unit. And also, as we saw, the Equalizer plus unit, honestly, the better pick, as we don't give up that much in the damage per mag and in the sustained DPS end of things. Here, the Coyote in the wrong range is then behind it. And this is that gap that always exists for the Coyote. Here's why actually on the weapon, of course, we don't have the option anymore. And that's also why we here have it on 60 instead of 58 we consistently saw throughout. With that FAMAS here, we don't have the option to take 3 crit damage mods. And because of that, we're not laying it out in that way. We're going actually here to 61, capping at 60. And that is a little bit wasteful, but that is actually then the optimal way to set up this FAMAS. Because otherwise the other option is 55, and actually, especially with Killer up, well, the 55 would actually be fine, kind of 55, 117, as we would have here with a crit chance flip to crit damage as a balance number. Especially with Killer and such, if we introduce those, the 60 is going to work out a little bit better. The Exodus and Nimble that we have here is actually basically losing about as much against the Equalizer plus unit as we normally see forces as well versus Coyote and such. And one thing we can basically say is that Equalizer plus unit, at least just for ARs, because keep in mind that when we're going SMG, when we're going LMG with a Striker, that second bonus wouldn't be active, and all of the exotics would actually effectively be a better choice, because as we saw, the Equalizer plus unit is ahead, for instance, than an Equalizer plus a Cheska that we would use maybe for an LMG or such. And then here, what we have is the Overdogs as well, actually, so above Exodus. But of course, yeah, Exodus basically has our brand bonus or brand bonus deactivated kind of item. Not that that's the case, because Exodus and Nimble both actually are really good pieces. Exodus especially can be a really good survivor tool, but they don't add to our damage. They add survivability or healing in the case of Nimble. One thing we can look at is, yeah, the unit is basically 7% ahead. That Overdogs is 30% ahead. How much uptime would we need on the Overdogs to kind of match that? Now, I'll already say that I've checked that it's 26, if I remember correctly, where the Overdogs overtakes it from 25 to 26. This is the point where the Overdogs with a 26% uptime, so 20%, 26% of our shots landing on a bonus enemies types. And especially keep in mind that that lowest tier, Grenadiers, Assaults, Snipers, Rushers, all of them are that lowest tier. Always your bonus against them. Some of the most common enemies, basically. And it really depends on the faction, where, for instance, yeah, with Black Tusk, a few more mini-tanks, Warhounds and such that are higher tiers. And there it could matter, but especially if you're, for instance, fighting Outcasts or Hyenas especially as well, you see a lot of the enemy types that you are bonused against. So you would need Overdogs to be basically less than 26% uptime for you to consider that unit piece. But also what we have then is Tinkerer. Now for Tinkerer, although actually let's discuss Bloody first. I'm jumping all over the place. But Bloody, adding into the total weapon damage here, we basically don't get a full 25% out of it. As we see, because that Obliterate is there as well, 24% total weapon damage from there, it's basically getting a little bit of diminishing returns. Here, a little bit over 20% remains of that 25% that we basically put in there. Now, Bloody would also line up a little bit more with just the Chest Striker. And yeah, there we could, for instance, go, but there it would still be basically Cheska plus a Bloody Knuckles would be my pick for a Chest Striker if we're going Bloody Knuckles. Because as we saw, again, the unit or the salvo is a little bit behind the Cheska when it is basically a single piece plus an exotic. If we put this overdogs actually back to 100% in the meanwhile as well, what we can take here is, yeah, with the Tinkerer, we have to bring in weapon talents. Now, the weapon talents here, measured, killer, streamline, some of the more common picks that I would recommend going with. Killer, of course, one of the better ones for just general play. And here, if we activate Killer for all of them, and the second row is basically just for the Tinkerer. So if we just were to have, for instance, with the Tinkerer, just Killer active, and our secondary was, let's say, something, although Fast Hands would be supplying us with some reload speed. If we were running Preservation, we would be healing with that. But basically, we have Killer plus a utility talent. What would our output be? And then, especially against the Equalizer plus unit, it is actually pretty far behind before if we're just going with one and the same damage talent. But of course, the thing we can do with the Tinkerer is bringing a second damage talent, and especially measured for a very consistent talent is one of my go-to picks. Now, of course, that's measured as a secondary. We're also going as it with the second as into that Tinkerer, because Killer, of course, has an activation rate. So if we're taking measured, but then putting Killer on top, Killer isn't always active. Measured kind of is. We're averaging it out here to smear it basically over the whole magazine as an average number. The Tinkerer does beat out our Equalizer plus unit. Equalizer plus Tinkerer beats that out by a little bit on here with the measured on top with the burst. Our sustain is actually a little bit below. This is the higher RPM that we get a little overall with the measured. And our sustain is also just a little bit above. But yeah, a little over 2.5% with our metrics that we have here, 20% headshot rate. That's decent enough that I would pick, if we're going with Killer first, measure as a second talent. Tinkerer is definitely still competitive to this, but then also this would mean that Equalizer plus Tinkerer, if we're going for an LMG, if we're going for an SMG, definitely still a pick. But then, yeah, the overdogs here with it just being active 100% of the time, way ahead of everybody else. And this is the main reason that, yeah, overdogs has become kind of the general use meta item that we have. If we actually put this to what I said before here, a 60-ish%, maybe even a 50% half uptime, we're still with that overdogs, even versus that really strong 20% assault rifle, we're still ahead by another 6 and a bit percent. And of course, on the sustain end as well, by the same amounts effectively. And this is the reason why I would say that my general meta pick for doing activities, missions, just running around, countdowns and stuff as well, is going to be that overdogs. Tinkerer is definitely a good pick as well. It is also important to keep in mind that, yeah, overdogs now is available in the general loot pool. It is also available through retaliation, through blueprints. Pretty easy, a lot easier to get than last season, where it was basically just one from the season track. Tinkerer, a little bit harder to get. We do need to get that master mission for the manager done to get the Tinkerer. That's still its only source. But very consistent still to get there, because actually, if you do it on master, if you can find the people to do it on master, you will have it guaranteed. And that's, yeah, there is no better guarantee than guaranteed. But yeah, you do need to go through a somewhat difficult mission, but it's not also, with a decent enough team, pretty easy. But that Tinkerer would still be ahead. But as a just general nothing on top, that Equalizer plus unit is actually really strong, as long, again, as it is an AR. Now, actually, here we can kind of see, but this is mostly then showcasing the difference between a FAMAS and a Lexington. But especially if you have a Lexington, you can't go Tinkerer. But you can go with, for instance, here, Equalizer plus just the unit, or Equalizer plus the overdogs. For the places that the overdogs doesn't work out, I would maybe keep a unit piece as just a glove extra. And that's likely what I'm going to do. I'm going to likely save the builds, actually, even with Equalizer plus unit. If it is an Obliterate Striker, And then I can always put in an overdogs for the places it works out well. And if that doesn't work out, I'll swap it out for a unit. Tinkerer, though, still also has a place in my heart, especially for killer plus fast hands. And even though, as we saw, if we give up that second damage talent on it, it drops quite a bit below, especially as well in the past, even the Coyote and such. And yeah, the Tinkerer then, though, is still, with fast hands, killer fast hands combo. I really enjoy that a lot as it helps me stay upright a lot more consistently. Coyote should also still be considered, especially in group settings. One Coyote in a team is definitely worth it at the very least. So from time to time, it is handy to kind of keep an eye on your buff bar. If you are in a group, then Coyote. But Coyote is no longer the go-to even solo. But yeah, overall, this lays out that, the Equalizer is definitely the big winner. And some of the exotics can compete with the combo as long as it's an AR. But especially as well, if we're not looking at ARs, the exotics kind of have the pick there, because especially they're also so much bigger than, of course, Cheska, because Unit already was so much bigger than Equalizer plus Cheska. So yeah, let's take it to a conclusion. And all that brings us to the conclusion of this first part of a two-parter looking into unit alloys. Of course, here we really needed to go over a lot of ways that, for instance, it could affect Striker, one of the grander builds of the game. In the second part, we'll go into depths into Heartbreaker, Tipping Scales, Umbra, some of the other gear sets that are well worth running, Hunter's Fury as well. And look how we should look at them and set them up. But especially in this part, we took the bases and put it, we built our castles already a little bit. We just need to furnish them, because a lot of the concepts that we've set up here, I won't reiterate in the second part, and we'll just go over what are some of the more optimal setups to go with and how do they land. As that will also be my way of figuring out how I want to change the build collection. As at the core of all of these in-depth looks is always, what will that mean for my own builds, and hopefully as well for others. But unit, we can definitely conclude, is on the first brand piece, equivalent effectively to a lot of the other brand pieces that are already around. It is a little bit behind Cheska, for instance, but that can differ depending on the crit chance, crit damage of the build. And then that second bonus, that assault rifle for the two-piece, is actually extremely strong and honestly only gets surpassed by exotics. And that's actually the thing nowadays. There are several exotics like the overdogs that are exceptionally large, at 30% that is active quite often, when even we put it to, let's say, 50% uptime, it still does do more than a lot of other pieces can. And of course as well, Tinkerer, always a good contender into the mix as well, especially with two good damage talents. And that is, I think, the way to look at unit, especially for Striker. Conclusions-wise, for me, I'm going to set up especially, first of all Obliterate Strikers are going to be with Equalizer. There is no equal. And I do hope that actually there isn't some future where the building them up to bring them down turns out to be an actual, a thing that the devs suddenly do. From a perspective of balance, this is definitely a little bit of power creep, but this is also a little bit. I feel actually the overdogs was more power creep, and then, for instance, some of the modifiers, like last season's one, was extremely power creepy. This one, though, it will definitely go everywhere where Obliterate will go. That conclusion kind of already we can make, even for other builds like Hunter's Fury, like Negotiators, and other places as well. And that one kind of stands. The Salvo is actually, in some builds, especially here on Striker, not the way to go. And that's actually, I think, what the baseline for me will become. I'll take a Equalizer for an Obliterate Striker. I'll pair that actually with a glove, unit glove. And that way as well, it can go into the glove slot and I can directly replace it with the overdogs. And of course, as always, I'll grab myself as well a striker glove so that I can have actually all of the pieces as required to, for instance, also go to Tinkerer, because I think though with the unit and with an overdogs, you can kind of cover the moments that overdogs won't be well worth it. And some places though, it is still, for me, I quite enjoyed, for instance, taking Tinkerer and then taking, we would have to drop down from Lexington, and it's definitely a drop down to go from that to, for instance, an FAMAS here with a Cetar alongside of it. And especially this killer fast hands combo is one that I really do lean towards with Tinkerer. But I think just having a unit glove and an overdogs will cover most of the situations you would need. But that is true only if you are running ARs. And sometimes I, even on Striker, do enjoy running LMGs, even though that nowadays we, for instance, have tipping skills that is very much a dedicated LMG style of build. And also, Strikers with SMGs works really well, but then again, you wouldn't want that second piece there to be the unit piece, because yeah, the exotics are too large, definitely in comparison to that. But overall though, the unit pieces, as kind of expected, overperforming by a little bit. I feel the power creep that they introduced with their 2 brand bonuses in a row that are very strong and of same size as some of the others. As of course, in the past, we have had Walker and Harris, for instance, but there, the weapon damage on the first piece is much smaller than other brands, basically half. And already weapon damage, not the top pick there anyway. And you would take that mostly just to kind of get into the second and third piece. Zvia in the same similar style, where the first piece is, you know, a magazine size leading into weapon damage. Here it is rate of fire leading into damage. And that might have not been the smartest pick. But overall though, yeah, it is definitely, of course, now that it is here, we'll just have to deal with it and run it. Equalizer is going in all these builds. I'm going to pair it mostly with an overdogs, a second piece unit for ARs, and yeah, that'll take us through at least Striker for now. We'll come back actually in the future, of course, to go through other builds in the part 2, but likely as well, I'll put an exotic, either the chest or the bittersweet rifle in between this and that part. As in the future, we're definitely going to go through those exotics. We're also going to go through Concentrated Company, and actually pretty close to the start of the season in these first few 2 or 3 weeks, I do want to make a tipping skills build showcase. Now that we have an upgraded, because I was kind of waiting for this new gear to come into the game, as we'll go into that as well. So I hope you join me for those. If this one was informative or enjoyable, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below. It does help out. So I'll do that little bit of shilling here. As I've said, a lot of words, and my tongue definitely feels like this, guys. But yeah, thank you for joining me. And as always, have a good night.